SEDC, and welcome to the SEDC webcast, an online educated platform at the Southern Economic Development Council. As we move forward, through this webcast, SEDC is excited to publish strategy conversations with economic developers, policymakers, business leaders, and subject matter experts. This is a free membership service to enhance professional capacity to continually accelerate economic development in the American South. And there are no better speakers than SEDC members and partners who collectively set the global professional standard in our industry. Today, we're happy to provide a special opportunity as this webcast features a recording of an SEDC Professional Development Initiative Summit held in 2022. At this summit, leaders from our friends in Ernst Young discussed economic resilience in the American South and new global economic trends and development strategies. We thank Tony DeLisi, Evan Fay, and Dean Shepard of EY for leading a great session, and we thank our SEDC members for tuning in. Enjoy the webcast.
Good afternoon, everybody. See a few familiar names on the attendee list, and it's nice to be here. I'm going to get rolling just so we get some time here, but really excited to be a part of this. Evan is a member of SEDC and has been for some years, and we do lots of work and are very involved in all of your states, and just love seeing what we can share about what we're seeing from an economic development and a site selection perspective, and hopefully it'll be of value. Say, as I'm going along, I wish this could be directly conversational and see some of you in person. But we love to hear from you and have this be somewhat interactive. So we're going to have some polling, but please feel free to type questions you might have in the chat. If they're relevant in the moment and we can address them, we'll get to them. We're also going to try to leave some time at the end for a bit of Q&A as it comes up. But yeah, Evan, if you could share the next slide, it's just a quick disclaimer. Get past that. Yeah, we don't need to read through it, but just know that we're speaking of our own volition, don't necessarily represent all the views of the Ernst Young US firm. But just quick introduction to myself. I'm Tony DeLisi. As Dr. Polson said, I'm Director of Strategy here within EY's Economic Development Practice. I'm based in Austin, Texas. It's an amazingly beautiful day today. It finally dropped about 10 degrees and is looking quite nice. I've been doing economic development strategic planning work for about 15 years, working with communities, big, small, rural, urban, all over the country. And it's been just an exciting journey. Love learning every day about what's going on, how the economy is changing, and how communities are evolving. Dean, like to say hi?
Thank you, Tony. Hello, everyone. Again, to echo what everyone said to this point, want to thank all the people who are participating, the organizations, and just allowing us to have a conversation for a little while. I'm part of the Global Location Investments Credits and Incentives team, as was mentioned, but I have almost a 20-year background in economic development here in the Phoenix metro area, Phoenix, Arizona, working for communities such as Scottsdale, Arizona, and Glendale, Arizona, and what have you. And I've also worked for the Arizona Commerce Authority, which is the state's economic development agency. I was part of the business attraction team responsible for net new job creation to the state of Arizona. In my time there, 3 or 4 years or so, I helped 30 different projects decide to come to Arizona, which means that was just about a $2 billion capital investment into the state of Arizona, and supported about 10,000 in job creation to the state of Arizona. So just a different perspective now on the consulting side of the table, but I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for allowing us to share our conversations with you today, and we look forward to a lively conversation.
Awesome. And then I'll round us out. Hey, everybody, I'm Evan Fay. I'm coming in from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I am on the Economic Development Advisory Services team with Tony. We work closely again with Dean and his team in global location investment incentives. I've been in economic development for about 6 years, both on the consultant side and as a practitioner, actually working in Oklahoma City for the Economic Development Partnership there. Again, echo everything that Tony and Dean have said, but special thank you to Matt and the SEDC team for giving us the privilege of kicking off this professional development initiative. So with that, I'll hand it back to Tony, and we'll get started.
Thanks, team. Well, And just to reiterate, EY, we are a large firm, and it's people don't always think, oh, they work in economic development and site selection, but we do. We have over 300,000 employees around the world, but we have a really robust government and public sector practice. We work closely with cities, states, counties, the federal government, as well as economic development organizations, and many more on a whole variety of different types of initiatives. Obviously, Evan and I, we're really focused on economic development, strategic planning, research, and all the myriad ways that manifests around the country. And it is great, as was mentioned, working right alongside our global location team and really getting that feel for what businesses are dealing with as we're working with governments and nonprofits and others to understand what they're dealing with and how do we bring that all together. And really, ultimately, I think, say this is true, but we're a firm that believes in working on for purpose. And I know in our team, we're really passionate about this. We enjoy helping communities. We love to learn. We love to evolve and be of service. So please always reach out if you got any questions, if you just want to chat about economic development or this field, or if there's anything that we can do to serve you. But to kick things off here, I have we have a polling question just to test things out. This is our icebreaker, and you can see it on the screen, and you should be getting the question come up. But which currently ranked football team will win the SEC this year? I apologize to those who might be fans of an SEC team not on this list, but hey, I don't make the votes. I don't make the ranking. Well, I'm going to vote on this one, but oh wait, I can't. I'm not allowed. Matthew, you want to close that up? Hopefully we'll have a chance. That was just our test run. And okay, Georgia, Alabama, like this. Well, it was a trick question. The answer is Michigan. Sorry. I know, not going to win the SEC, but I am a Michigan alum from grad school, so I've got to, say a little go blue while I'm at it. But also being in Texas, I know that there's, we have more than just the SEC representing SEDC states. But thanks. Okay, the polling system works. We know this is operating. So on our next slide, just to reiterate what we want to talk about today, the topic is economic resiliency. And so we want to spend a little time exploring what that means, and particularly what it means and what it looks like in the American South today. Dean's going to share a bit about how this relates to global business trends and foreign direct investment. And then Evan will conclude some with considering how different communities and regions are really adapting to those trends and to build greater resilience in their communities. So if there's one thing really to take away from today, I'll say that this doesn't happen on its own. And that's a lesson that got me into planning as a field and all of this back when I was a very green 18-year-old, was the realization that the world we live in didn't just happen this way. People have been making decisions, good or bad, for many, many years that have dictated where infrastructure goes, that leads to where people decide to live, where businesses locate, where they thrive, and where they might close. And so I really believe firmly that making your community resilient does require that honest assessment of understanding where you are, what's working, what isn't working, taking some good strategic thinking to say, where do we want to be based on where we are today? And truly, I don't know if it's going to come out through everything, but that collaboration element is so key. We can't do this alone anymore as just an economic developer. It takes a village, but it takes the whole team that you have in your communities and folks really working in alignment towards various goals. So I think we'll share a bit about how that's going to play out in this conversation today. This really follows what I laid out there essentially, but I'm going to share a bit about resiliency in the American South today and what that looks like. Dean will speak a bit more, and then Evan, and then we'll have a little wrap up at the end and some time for questions. So with that, let me ask a second polling question here. Matthew, if you could cue that up. Yeah, to you, what's the most important factor when you think of economic resiliency? And if you've got an idea that I didn't put on there, and this is not meant to be exhaustive at all, so if you got other elements, please type them in the chat, but just give it another couple of seconds. Then you want to close it, Matthew? Let's see what we got here. Okay, we got industry diversity taking the lead. It's not a huge surprise there. And I like workforce and infrastructure coming in there, and leadership. No others. Okay. Well, you're all right, I think is the answer. When you think about economic resiliency, I do like the US EDA definition. When they think about economic resilience, it's your community, a region's ability to quickly recover from a shock. And I think our understanding what a shock can be has evolved over the last 2.5 years. But not just recover, but how strong is your ability to withstand a shock and the variety of forms that could take? And then ultimately, how can you avoid that shock altogether? So when we're thinking about the other factors that go into that, y'all were hitting a number of those in the head. Industry diversity comes up a lot. If you're a one-trick pony, it's not going to go too far. If you've just got that one industry, that one company that drives your entire economy, you're vulnerable to a shock if something happens to that particular business or that industry. It wasn't selected as much by y'all, but economic equity is coming up in a lot of our conversations around the country. And when we're thinking about resiliency, if large segments of your population don't have the same access to resources and opportunities, and you see major divides around income and education and other factors in your community, those can really show cracks for where a shock can further set you back and cause concern and challenges in terms of recovering and actually the impact of those shocks. And that goes to resource access, whether that's PPP loans or other small business resources that came up during COVID, or things that existed before and are going to exist afterwards. Are they available? Do you have enough programs for businesses, for individuals around workforce and other areas? I really think that the collaborative environment plays a significant role in this resilience, and particularly around communication systems. We've seen this coming out of the pandemic, having helped build a number of different economic recovery and resiliency strategies, that those communities that didn't have strong communication and collaboration in place before COVID really struggled to get through in terms of hastening recovery, whether it's deploying resources, getting people connected to each other to help bolster support systems. And then one that kind of might fall off when we're talking about the economy, but is so important to think about, are those population support systems, your healthcare system, public safety, all those other factors that might not be economically driven, but are really critical to making sure that you have a healthy population, that things are able to function, that people feel safe and secure and able to operate when there is a hurricane or a tornado or a pandemic and so forth. So it's just something to consider when we're thinking about resilience. And I'll talk a bit more as we go through about how that manifests and what that looks like. But it is important, and you'll see on the next slide, with all of this, we really do take this integrated approach to building a more resilient economy. And it's the exact focus is different for every community, but thinking through all those different factors that influence your ability to withstand and recover, et cetera, from a shock. But if it's housing, looking at your public policy, talent and education, that built environments and infrastructure, your innovation system. I don't think we're going to talk about it much today, but I thought it was so fascinating coming out of, or in the middle of the pandemic. We saw a lot of retail shops closing in many communities or restaurants. And I thought, well, we're going to have vacant space. This is the moment for entrepreneurship. If you've been thinking about starting a small business, a restaurant, something facing the public in your community, there's more vacant storefront than we've seen in years. So how do we make sure that we're ready to bolster people up and help them get going on those new ventures? So there's lots of different ways to approach this, and truly they are unique to each community. And that takes that moment of introspection and looking at your needs, looking at your data, talking to folks in the community to really get a feel for what makes sense for you and how you need to grow your economy and focus your strategic efforts going forward. So with that bit of background, you're going to hear a bit more from me, and I apologize, I don't love talking all day, but we'll get to Dean soon. But I'm going to share a little bit of data and tell a bit of a story as we see it when we're looking at resiliency in the American South today. So first things up, before we jump into this, I'd love to ask all of you, just thinking about your own community, where you live, where you work. Great. How would you grade your community's economic resilience? And I'm trying to think, what's the college that doesn't do grades, like Bard? I don't know. But I believe in grades. So, all right, let's close this out. How are folks doing? All right. That D, we had 2 Ds. If you can, in the chat, I would love, I don't know if you could say why you said a D in a short phrase in the chat that we could hear. I'd be just kind of curious as we're going through this. But it's interesting, B, that it kind of makes sense. So I'll just say, and I'm going to go to the data here, but yeah, next slide's great, Evan, thanks. Overall, I'll say, preview, spoiler alert, the South is doing relatively well. Well, and the keyword here is relative, so B maybe is the right grade. But to say that COVID was an unprecedented shock obviously puts it mildly. I've been using this same chart you're looking at here for 2 years because it's really jaw-dropping. We had the longest period of uninterrupted growth in US history leading up to the pandemic. 10 straight years of job creation, which is just incredible. And then we lost all of those jobs in a 1-month period. We gained many of them back relatively quickly, but we've never seen anything quite like this. And we were all here. Everybody was wondering how's the recovery going to look? What does this mean? How fundamentally are things going to change? As I think we're going to discuss, some things didn't change that much at all, and some really did. But if you take a look on the next slide, if you really dig in and say, so how did this play out in the South? Southern states fared relatively well. What you're seeing here, the bars are total employment in all of the SED states in millions over the last 10 years. And then that little triangle is how the rest of the US is performing relatively. It's not the absolute number, but if you started at the same baseline, what you really see there is in 2020, job losses were much more significant in the rest of the country than you saw in the South. And the recovery has not been quite as rapid. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that this really tracks to that when we look at unemployment, it's the same relative pattern. But I put this to say that this doesn't mean that there were no impacts. You look at that spike in unemployment, those are individuals that lost their jobs, families that lost income. There were significant impacts in so many communities, and they varied within communities, between communities. If you were a heavy tourism destination, you certainly felt this more than others, and there were a variety of factors that played into this. But it is still nice to see that SED states, while unemployment spiked, it did not spike as high as you saw in the remainder of the US, and the recovery again has been a little bit faster. And this is what is so interesting too, is that the pace of recovery has been much more rapid. If you look at the last 5 years where data is available, just through 2021, SEDC states grew 3%, whereas the remainder of the US, there was no growth. And that is COVID, but it's a telling story that the rest of the US, looking at it, has not recovered to 2016 levels, or is about recovered 2016 at the end of 2021. Whereas SEDC is up and above. The growth is back. It's getting back on track a little more quickly and a little more robust fashion. But that doesn't tell the whole story. It's interesting, again, when you dig in a little further, and this is showing by sector, green bar, SEDC states, the rest of the US in the maroon, and where were net new jobs created or lost over that 5-year period. And what is really fascinating here is that the most significant job losses for other parts of the US were around trade, primarily retail trade, and travel and leisure, accommodation, restaurants, etc. And likely, I'm not going to make a direct impact correlation, but A lot of this is probably driven by public policy response to COVID. When you think about how locked down communities were and restrictions in terms of travel and access to restaurants and so forth, it had a stronger impact in many of the other states that were a little tighter than some of those southern states. And again, it's not a perfect correlation. Every state, even in SEDC, was different. But you see that particularly when you look at retail, whereas travel and leisure, there was still a significant impact to travel and leisure and to tourism destinations and business travel all across the southern states. But it was even more significant when you look at the rest of the country. And I don't think that's because they have more tourists necessarily, but it was just how locked down were those, how tight were the markets. On the flip side, transportation really boomed across the US, everywhere through this period. So we saw all those job losses with in-store shopping, dining, sitting in a hotel, but a huge growth in transportation and in professional services. And it was interesting, one note that particularly stands out for economic developers was that manufacturing has continued to grow in southern states over this period, whereas it has lost jobs in some of those other states. So I always like to key into that when we're thinking about that industry diversity and those good paying jobs and other areas that we're really focused on. So another element, just looking at the South and how things have played out over the last few years, is around labor. And I love people selected workforce, I think, is number 3 when we're talking about elements of resiliency. And I know labor is so tight. We saw the unemployment rate and how it's dropped even to pre-pandemic levels, and it was the tightest it's ever been before the pandemic. But although labor is tight, I'm not buying the stories that you hear about the Great Resignation. I don't know how much people have read into this or understanding it, but when you really look at the true numbers around labor force participation, and we're looking at active labor force, people in working age, out of college, not retired yet. And those numbers fudge in different directions, I know, but this is kind of our best level. But we're really seeing strong growth in the size of the labor force and actually growth in labor force participation over the last decade. The labor force size growth has been pretty steady in the South and actually stronger, we'll see on another slide, than the rest of the country. But you see the middle level is tracking that participation rate. And although there was a slight dip in 2020, things are back up actually to the highest level in a decade in 2021. And that's data that was just released 2 weeks ago from the census, the latest American Community Survey data, when we really dig in. And it tracks what we're seeing, which is more movement of people into new jobs, but not necessarily a mass exodus from the labor force that you'll hear stories about that I'd say are a little overblown and maybe conflating retirement with resignation. And the really positive story that we see here for the South is that the Southern labor force over the last 5, or actually the last 10 years, has grown twice as fast as the rest of the US. And with talent, along with sites probably being the top 2 things that we hear so much about from companies as their biggest needs, that's a really exciting story to hear, because the southern states are where people are moving, where that active working age labor force is growing. And that's going to make you all even more competitive for bringing in those businesses and those diverse businesses and building out your resiliency. Where there's some concern, though, even still with this, and we'll see on the other side, is that educational attainment within that continues to lag. So SEDC states are growing that labor force more quickly, but actual educational attainment is about 4 percentage points lower in terms of bachelor's degree and higher. If you look at associate, it's on par. It's even. Remainder of the US, southern states, all about 9% holding associate degree. High school graduation, also about on par. And I was thinking about this, and there's a couple of factors I think going on. One of it is that likely better educated people are less likely to move, to immigrate or migrate to a new state for a new job, because they likely have a decent job in the place where they live and are able to access some of that opportunity in other parts of the US. And other factors are historically a higher concentration of educational institutions in some of those other parts of the US, so post-secondary institutions. And so that this trend is shifting, but it is something to be on the lookout for. That, you know, despite that labor force growth, still not necessarily on the same page in terms of the higher ed achievement, especially the bachelor's degree and higher. So all around, I know I'm putting a lot of different elements, but I think these really relate to those trends that we see and how we're thinking about the resiliency of our community and what's growing. But I always want to remind us to continue to keep an eye on that equity piece of it, because this is a significant factor. You know, every community is dealing with economic equity to some degree. There are disparities that exist between different populations, whether along racial lines or geographic, however you name it. And those disparities can create greater fragility in your economy and greater challenges, whether that's around building up workforce, helping people start new businesses, just engaging in the overall ecosystem, which affects, you know, your population support systems and so many other things. And it remains such a big issue. But what's really exciting that we found doing this research for a lot of years, doing a lot of great work in terms of addressing barriers to opportunity, is that, you know, there's tons of science and research going on that supports investing and working on these topics. And part of that includes, if you could show the next slide, Evan, you know, you can't read this all that well, there's a lot on here, but that inclusivity is truly tied to resiliency and to economic growth overall. We have a inclusivity index that we've put together. It's pretty simple. It's measuring communities based on the racial gap between income, poverty, education, and share of population in managerial positions. And when you look at that inclusivity index, we really do find consistently over the years that those communities that are more inclusive, that have created more opportunity, and the gaps between people of different backgrounds is smaller than ever, they're also the faster growing communities. You ask chicken or the egg, I think they go hand in hand. People are attracted to and move to those fast growing opportunities, or those communities, and those communities are, you know, creating new wealth, creating new opportunities for the people that live in them. And it's really exciting to see this. There's some outliers here because COVID threw numbers off a bit, and tourism and all of that, but it's nice to see that holding up. So that's my piece. I was going to pass it on to Dean, but just sharing some of the perspectives on what we're seeing out there.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. So, I mean, I think this is really interesting. And one of the questions from my economic development days that I've often asked is, you know, should Wi-Fi be a utility? You know, that's kind of a controversial, the Cox and the Quest and all those guys will say, no, no, no. However, when you talk about equity, and accessibility is equity, in my opinion, you know, should Wi-Fi, which we're all based on the internet, I mean, technology is great when it works, but for the COVID really hit us on who has accessibility to information, and how is that information gathered and utilized. And I think, and so that's the question. That begs the question: is should Wi-Fi be a public utility? And that's just something I'll leave to the crowd to debate on your own. But from my opinion, I think it's a pretty valid question, and just something to kind of dive into from an economic development standpoint, and equity, and all the different things that Tony has led into. So for foreign direct investment trends, so my part with the global, so our group is the Global Location Investments, Credits, and Incentives, or short GLICI, right? And we work with companies from an international perspective, inbound to North America. And I want to make sure we understand North America being the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And we work with companies from all four corners of the globe, right? Western Europe, Asia, India, or the Africas, South America. All these companies are considering operations in the US. So with that, Evan, can we go to the next slide, please? So let's start out the conversation, if you will, with a question. I mean, I think you guys can read the question, but which one of these is a priority for your community when we start talking about foreign direct investment and building the story, or building the opportunity to be evaluated by a company that's considering operations in the United States? Please go ahead and take a few minutes to answer. Okay, can we go ahead and move past that? Let's see what the results are. Aha, skill set, development, real estate, combined, your story. Interesting. Interesting. Can we close this out, Evan? Interesting that there's such a small percentage on your story, and I'll dive into that. But I think there's always the baseline, right, of what we're looking for, how we're evaluating the potential for a company to drill down and select a specific community. And I will say that we have a lot of activity. EY as a firm has a lot of activity. Our group has a lot of activity in the Southeast. There's some really strong opportunities that are considering the Southeast, as well as Southwest and the kind of the central corridor area of the middle of the U.S., where we have, Ohio, the traditional Rust Belt, if you will. So there's areas that are doing well, and there's areas that are really active. You could classify Georgia as being very active, Texas, of course. But I also think that it's time now, because of that activity, that the states who haven't seen as much activity, it's their opportunity to really position themselves for more activity. And I would highlight Alabama or Mississippi or some of the other states that I think are in a prime position to really start getting attention. And when we start from foreign direct investment opportunities, and there's so many factors that we go into, and if you look at it, we kind of drive in from a large funnel opening and drill down in a process of elimination. And there's several factors that go into that data set, those quantitative data analysis that we're producing, and it's driven in collaboration with the client and ourselves and our experience and our team. And how do we come through with selecting, what's the best opportunity for the company, the client, to have some success? But really, for this conversation, there's some interesting points of view in that, companies are really looking at their suppliers, their vendors, raw materials, what raw materials are coming from the US, Canada, what type of suppliers are already here that they could quickly engage with, what are the opportunities to build vendor relationships so we can eliminate the need to enlist transatlantic or coastal type supply chain logistical operations and coming in off the coasts and what have you. And so there's that type of information that we're really understanding. And then, of course, the proximity to client. Like if I'm building something in Europe, do I have to ship it across the Atlantic to my client base in North America? Well, business case, that doesn't necessarily pencil anymore. And so that's really where we're looking at what's the most effective and least cost opportunity for the client to see a better P&L when they're reading through and presenting that information to the board. So that's what we're looking at as well. And again, what are the communities doing? What's the opportunity for the communities to position themselves? And really, you can again look at from a top-down perspective. The state's going to offer what they're going to offer as far as their incentive programs, their different mechanisms of support, job training, and what have you. Maybe it's property tax abatement, sales tax abatement, whatever those programs are. But then you even drill down further, where we are really focusing on the communities and the community's ability for speed to market. How quickly can you make those inspections? How quickly can those permits be issued? How quickly can the permits be, if there's an issue, how quickly can it be resolved? Who's the team in place to help us ensure that this project is going to go from cradle to CFO and in a timely fashion and meet the demands of the client? Because if you think about it, the client is losing money until those operations begin, until they start generating revenue from those operations. And typically, the revenue generation isn't really going to be in a situation for the company to be profitable for a good 3 to 5 years. So how can we generate a return on investment to help offset the investment that the company is making, right? That's really what we're looking at. And then we talk a lot about ESG, right? There's a lot of talking about sustainability, carbon neutrality, all of these different things that is really spearheaded, well, not spearheaded, but certainly manifested or supported, if you will, from the federal level all the way down. But when the companies are looking at ESG, what's the community's role in ESG? What's the community doing from an ESG and sustainability perspective? Are they looking at a total solution where the state, the region, counties, and the community are engaged in a strategic plan that will offer a company that's coming in a specific sustainability opportunity. So are the agencies in alignment so that the company can then be in alignment with their goals and their strategy to the community, county, region, and state? That's another key factor. And yes, there's a cost associated with that. There's a cost opportunity to support that. And that's, we're looking at that. So it's not just incumbent on the companies and the private sector. How are the public sectors also aligning their resources for ESG? And then we look at some other situations like the sector resources. What different public-private, do you have in tow placement agencies or recruiters, or how can you help attract the type of workforce that's needed? So how is the community in a full partnership, or the public sector in full partnership with the community, the private sector, and how is that manifesting to provide a holistic solution for the client? So that's another case that we're looking at. And then, of course, what's the business and political climate, right? There's always intended and unintended consequences for policy, right? And so is that policy directed towards the betterment of the business community, which the business community is going to support the citizens? The citizens are going to be able to have a type of lifestyle that and a tax situation that supports the community. How is all that hand in hand? And if you also think about it, the incentives, yes, we're really looking at those and how we can monetize and create that return on investment. But what's the actual cost of being in that community post incentives? Because the incentives are going to sunset. 10 years, 5 years, whatever that sunset is, it's going to sunset. So what's the actual cost for that business to be in your community? And that's what we're looking at as well. Take away all the incentives, are great. What's the ongoing support? What's the business retention and expansion strategies that the communities have in place? And what's the actual cost of being in that community? And then, of course, we talk about, and I think this goes right into your story. And so it's kind of interesting that we got a response the way we did. But like the public amenities and the lifestyle, is it a foodie? Are you a foodie community? Are you a college community? Do you have the microbrewery scene? Do you have destination type of opportunities that you can start telling your story? Do you have, the story that, hey, we do this and we do that, and this is why, you should consider our community. So that's the story. That's the intangible that we're also looking at, particularly when we're on site tours, when we're going with the client to do site tours. What's the vibe of the community? What are you guys about? Are you an artist community? What is it that makes you special or stands out in the whole kind of situation here? And then, of course, from international firms, there's what they're looking at. They're looking at what's the skill set of the labor pool. And considering that manufacturing, we work primarily with manufacturing, but we do have corporate headquarters and what have you. But really the skill set, is the community able to support AI? Are they able to support the engineers that are going to implement the robotics? Because I don't think manufacturing, the people are going to be making the widget. The robotics are making the widget, and the people are supporting the application and the smoothness of those robotics. So it's really the engineers, and there's a whole different topics of engineers. So to that skill set that Tony mentioned earlier, is the community adapting and responding and supporting a higher skill set level? And how does that look? How are they promoting those opportunities for a firm that's going to be less employment count, but very high CapEx because of the robotics and the infrastructure they're putting in place for their manufacturing process? Again, that also speaks to if a company is coming in to the community, what's the long-term strategy here? Because a company is from the overseas is not coming to the U.S. to be there for 5 years. They're coming to be at that location for 50 to 100 years. I mean, they're really looking at a long-term lens for their decision to locate in a particular community. So how is the partnerships with the workforce development, with the universities, with the K through 12? Are the companies able to speak to the K through 12 and to the parents and to the different type of legacy opportunities? And I don't think I'm sharing anything that you don't already know or you haven't thought about, but let's put it in context to how it's positioned when a company is evaluating, and we're evaluating with the company, your community. That's really what's interesting here. And then, of course, The other factor is, you know, what's the compliance for hiring or transitioning internationals into your community? Those are other things that we're looking at. What's the regulatory system for the U.S. when bringing foreign internationals in, or helping? What's the community resources for helping recruit from out of state? Again, we looked at, which I think is interesting for the Southeast, is, you know, what are the migration patterns, right? The migrations patterns have been into the Georgias and to the Alabamas and out west here into Arizona. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, which is why I glow with such sunshine, right? Because it's just about 100 degrees today, so we're actually having a cooling trend. So I'm actually going to put a jacket on because I'm a little chilly, right? So what are the migration patterns, and what's the skill set of those migration patterns, and then how are all those people integrated into your community as a potential resource, and what are you doing to support that as an opportunity for a business that's able to access that talent, right? And then, of course, the big thing is it's really the developable and affordable real estate, because real estate is becoming, especially in the active markets, it's becoming increasingly difficult from a little 30-acre site to a massive 5 or 1,000 or 2,000 acre site. They're becoming less and less available, and there's several factors to that. But one of the things that we're looking at is a big requirement is, you know, what's the developability? Are there any barriers? Are there any, you know, protected species that we don't know about? Are there any archaeological situations that we don't know about? Do we have a hidden river underneath that thing that's going to, you know, compromise the soil? You know, are there seismic issues that we have to deal with? Are there reinforcements that we have to deal with? And how is all that in a transparent way given, so that when we're making a choice for real estate, the client has there's all information that's you know, available for their review. And then, of course, you know, we are a consumer-driven economy. We're all about consumerism, and we have been about consumerism for the last 2 or 3 decades, I'll say. And so tapping into the U.S. consumer is also a key opportunity, right? And maybe that's indirect or direct, to put my soccer terms in play here. You know, you have the indirect method, which is through a B2B type of relationship, or you have a direct opportunity with directly to the client. And then that taxation, everywhere else is a VAT tax. In the US, it's a point of purchase tax, sales tax. So how is all that affected? And then what is the opportunity to gather that information to support a company's desire to tap a certain market segment or tap a certain demographic, or however that looks. So those are all kind of contributing factors that we're in basic strategic conversations with the clients and with inbound to the foreign direct investment. And so anyways, hopefully that kind of paints a little picture. Can we go to the next slide, Evan, please? So I think, you know, to leave it at that is, how are you positioning? What's your story? How are you positioning all of your assets, all of your opportunities into a very specific conversation that we are able to evaluate, and we are able to have that meaningful and thoughtful conversation with the client to say, yes, this is where we definitely want to look at because of the demographic trends, because of this, because of the lifestyle, because of all these things, the cost factor and all that. These are all attributes to what we want to look and what we want to explore at the level of the community. So yeah, thank you for your time again, Tony, again, and Evan. I think it's you're up, so you're up to the plate.
Awesome, thank you, Dean. And I will also mention, I know I saw Matthew from the SEDC put in the chat that the chat function may not be working well, and so if you'd like to, you know, drop a question or interact, I think you can use the Q&A function, and I'm not 100% sure how that works. I can't see that as the panelist, but, you know, Matthew, if you need to chime in and say anything, feel free to. So I will go ahead and bring us home, talking about, you know, we've set our baseline of how's the South doing right now in terms of resiliency and growth, talking about what's important from a foreign direct investment standpoint. And now I want to leave, you know, this group with kind of 3 high-level community resiliency issues, but programs of work that we can begin to tackle as economic developers. So to kind of kick us off, we'll start with the polling question. So on which types of resiliency initiatives are you or is your community currently working on? And this is a single choice, even though it says select all that apply. So if there is an initiative that stands out in your mind, go ahead and select that one, but I'll give you guys a few seconds to do that. All right, let's see what we came up with. So product development, and that's exciting. It's almost as though you guys read my slides ahead of time. That is definitely one of the things that we'll cover. It seems like there's a lot of work being done in equity. It's neck and neck between industry cluster diversification, workforce systems, communication, small business support, and then economic equity. We've got a few working on that as well. So we'll go ahead and jump in. So looking at what we believe are our three drivers, of course, this isn't all inclusive, but we believe that these are the main thematic elements of what future resiliency and growth really looks like in today's economy, especially the American South. So we'll talk a little bit about cluster strategies, what it looks like to move from emphasizing these big singular projects and whale hunting to looking at economic development, recruitment projects from a supply chain and ecosystem perspective. We'll talk a little bit about agility, and so that's where the product development piece comes in, looking at building partnerships that result in speed to market and agility in terms of product and site development. And then we'll talk a little bit about culture and storytelling. I know that's been a theme that's continued to come up today. It's just how we tell our story, what we do as economic developers and why it matters in terms of creating prosperous economies for all. So looking at cluster strategies, I know this is a theme or concept that many are familiar with, especially on the heels of the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But looking to the future, this kind of shotgun approach to economic development may continue to net results in recruitment and attraction. But those who have a more focused cluster-based strategy will likely be seen as more successful, at least in the near term. And so when we're thinking about economic clusters, I like to use the Brookings Institute's definition, which is a group of firms that gain a competitive advantage through local proximity and interdependence. And so you can think about this as, research universities, private companies, venture capital, private equity, workforce, infrastructure, things like that, that are all interdependent on each other. And I should also note here that, when we're thinking about cluster strategies, we may have a mix of more urban and rural communities on the call today. And so this is really where regionalism comes into play. I should mention, a lot of communities don't have maybe a tier one research institute, headquarter companies, venture capital, private equity, ecosystems, and so on. And so aligning yourself, if you are in one of those communities, with regional assets is a perfectly acceptable way to really leverage a cluster strategy. And so we're really thinking about, at the bottom there, you see kind of icons for biotech, for electrification and mobility, aerospace, advanced mobility. We're really looking at, industries and the fabric of support organizations, like what we see in North Carolina with biotech and the Research Triangle, the work that the Tulsa region's doing with advanced mobility and unmanned aerial systems and things like that. And so, if you or your community is really at the early stages of determining, what might be a cluster worth pursuing, would certainly encourage you to look to your region's colleges and universities, understand what research is taking place, what's being commercialized, look to your startup environment, understanding what types of companies are really finding traction in the marketplace, and beginning to develop an asset map of all the resources, organizations that support this cluster, and use your convening power to hold meetings and focus groups and understand the local appetite for formalizing the cluster. As you see here, there's some inputs. Clusters are typically driven by the private sector, and then they may be funded publicly when there's some traction that's seen. They're aligned with regional workforce development infrastructure, and they're investing in that built environment, whether it's things like wet lab space for biotech or beyond visual line of sight testing grounds for unmanned aerial systems and things like that. And the outputs for the community, which is really what matters to us as economic developers, are improved productivity, attraction of talent, of highly skilled workforce, increased workforce opportunities for your population, and then greater diffusion of innovation really across the cluster. As we've seen in some more mature clusters lately, we're starting to see how both public and private investment is piling in to kind of pour gasoline on that fire. So recently in the last month, President Biden announced 21 projects for the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, totaling nearly $1 billion in cluster-based development and investment. And I was talking to Tony and Dean, I thought this was awesome. Looking at the map, over half of the Build Back Better Regional Challenge awards went to SEDC states. So I believe it was 52%, something like that. And so I think that speaks to the momentum that's happening in many of your economies and a lot of the forward progress that's going to be made in the years to come. So very exciting. Hats off to you all. The CHIPS and Science Act also is going to follow on funding to build out innovation and research hubs to the tune of about $10 billion, really focusing on semiconductor manufacturing, where those are clusters and the related supply chains. So there's an opportunity now for communities that have components of that to really leverage some of that funding. Also wanted to highlight, some of the private investment that's taking place in clusters in the South. So Wolfspeed, formerly Cree, is investing $5 billion into the world's largest carbide manufacturing facility in North Carolina. This will be a critical part of semiconductor manufacturing. They've, I think, given about $4 million to North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University to create workforce development pathways programs. And so they're really going to attract, I think, as well, some funding from the CHIPS and Science Act. So it's a perfect example of what happens when you have a cluster that's really attracting that investment. And similarly in Tennessee and Kentucky, with Ford's monumental investment in Blue Oval City in Tennessee, and then the Blue Oval SK battery campus in Kentucky. So excellent examples of really private sector led, potentially public sector funded cluster development. And another thing that we've talked about, you see some of these headlines here: speed to market. Ford broke ground on Blue Oval City within 1 year of announcing that project. This is really a function of that local unification. So economic developers, sitting in the center of this kind of cross, those unified partnerships with the real estate and development community, educational institutions to ensure the right workforce at the right time, utility providers, government officials. This concept of shovel readiness is still important. However, it's that next tier of community readiness that's really taking over. How harmonized are all of these different partners along with your local municipal and political leadership? And so this is an area where we believe, us as economic developers can really lean in and improve, the environment for location decisions and create a turnkey approach to site selection. And so, I think, again, if we're thinking about what we can take away from this conversation today, as EDOs and economic development leaders, if not already, you can begin laying the groundwork for a lot of these partnerships now. So moving along, kind of a different visualization of the graph that Tony shared earlier, we really believe in an integrated approach. And so, we've seen the Economic Development Organization evolve over the last 5, 10, 15 years to meet the needs of the market, but also out of necessity. We've seen, economic development organizations developing their own tech strategies to tell their stories of workforce and industry. We've seen, project managers and recruiters becoming more industry subject matter focused in areas like life sciences or mobility. that are kind of running those projects in-house. We've seen philanthropic organizations setting big, audacious goals for communities and keeping resources behind, these strategies to tackle them. And so I show you this to say, while we may be talking about product and infrastructure or site development, you can't think about that nowadays without talking talent and education, without looking at the community leadership and how well they collaborate. The public policy environment, which we'll talk about here in a second. Housing is continuing to be a topic of conversation, availability and affordability, as well as transportation and mobility. And so, as you're thinking about your strategies to carry your organization and your community into the future, be thinking about who else needs to be at the table, whether in-house or from the community, to tackle these conversations. So I know we're running up against time. I'll be brief and kind of wrapping it up and handing it back to Tony. Thought it was interesting in Dean's poll how the telling your story was in the last place, or at least important among the others. We really believe that this is paramount to resiliency and growth as a forward-looking statement. And so it's all about making economic development matter to your community, to your business community, to your education and workforce providers, to your politicians, and to the man or the woman on the street corner, the everyday citizen, in your community. Our job as economic developers, I think, is to really translate all of the macro work that we do into usable terms that matter to a massive stakeholder base. And this is going to happen through storytelling, both internal to your community and external to the world. And it's important because if you don't tell your story, somebody else is going to develop it and tell it for you. We've seen this look like, a story built around a single economic indicator, like that community isn't diverse enough, or the people in that community don't want to work, or there's been damage from large corporations pulling out of communities saying, we tried to make it work there, but we couldn't keep our facility running for more than 3 years. And it kind of forever tarnishes that community until they decide to tell their own story and equip others to really promote it with one voice. And so that, kind of moves from point one to point two in communicating the importance of our work. Economic development, as we've mentioned, is an ecosystem. It's interconnected, full of partners and resources that advance prosperity. And a lot of these, partners, whether they're nonprofits or whether they're, education and workforce providers, they may not see their day-to-day as economic development, but it really is. And so, as economic developers, we have the opportunity to cast the vision and really be proactive to lead in attraction and retention in bringing those other types of organizations along. And kind of getting to that second point, which I'll make my last point, we think economic development professionals, need to command the space that they occupy. Without going into specifics, headline news from state and local politicians, it does impact standing and corporate location decisions. They're watching, the news about educational policy, about healthcare, about social issues. And so this is tricky, it's nuanced. Many of us know projects that didn't land for one reason or another, but it's difficult to really quantify and communicate that impact. And so, that there's an opportunity cost of potentially thousands of jobs, billions in capital expenditure, and really generational prosperity if, that kind of political headlines and storytelling, isn't coming from a place where it's educated on the impacts for economic developers. And so that quality of place, it's critical in creating that quality of place for companies and for individuals who want to live in your community. So I kind of rushed through the end there, knowing that we're short on time. Hopefully that leaves, each of you with, empowerment, kind of with a few strategic priorities to take back to your office. I like to think of things in terms of how does this change your Monday? And so hopefully there's some new information from Tony, Dean, or myself that changes your Monday just a little bit, causes you to reframe a portion of your work and think about your community strategy in a different way. And so if we can help you think through that in any of these items, don't hesitate to reach out. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Tony to wrap us up for the day. But thank you all for your time and attention.
Yeah, thanks, Evan and Dean. And let's just jump in. We'll skip the poll. I know we're a little over. So I'll just say, let's wrap it all up. Repeating a bit, but you can't predict the future with this stuff. And when we're talking about avoiding shocks, most people weren't predicting a pandemic. Some maybe were. They hopefully were investing in vaccine stock and made a lot of money. But you can make your community more resilient by. I got one of my clicks. I really believe, and this is selfish plug as a community strategist, but having that collaborative strategy, you need to know where you want to go, know where you are today, and know how you're going to get there. Strategy might change, but really bringing your team along and really thinking big picture. Economic resilience is about more than just total jobs and capital investment. There are all of these factors that come into play and really affect your ability to be successful. And I always reiterate here is that checking in, review your data, talk to your businesses and your constituents. Don't just market externally and communicate externally, but really understand your community. Know where you are, how things are changing, what's improving, what's a great asset, and where there are stubborn challenges that you really need to dig into. But overall, with all of this, it is that authentic storytelling. You're not going to be able to change all the headlines. There might be, there are always things that are outside of our control. But if you're true to your community and who you are and what you have to offer and what you're looking for in terms of those long-term partners, whether it's a foreign company coming in wanting to be there 50 to 100 years, don't put up a false front, because that will fall apart. And even if you land the company, they might not last. Be true to your blemishes and your strengths, and really work as a community to move forward. And I think you're going to have the most success. And with that, we've got some contact information for us. We're not hard to find. We're always out here, and we love talking about this stuff, and we're in here for a reason. But I'll go to Matt. Do you have any last notes?
Well, what a great session. So thank you so much to EY. And we have this recorded, so we'll make it available. And let me echo Tony's comments. Yes, please reach out to our friends from Ernst Young anytime. They have been such a fantastic resource to many of our partners, including me. When I led a state association in Kentucky, did a massive research competitive analysis project for us, which was fantastic. And we're also available for other calls and consultation outside of that project agreement too. So we thank you so much, team from Ernst Young, for joining us. More importantly, thank you for your commitment to economic development in the entirety of the nation, especially in the American South. So before we close, let me thank our audience of SEDC members that are here with us today. Thank you for all that you do.